July 4th, 1776 is considered America's birthday. But given what we know about America's roots enslaving Black people and building systems of oppression after slavery was abolished, I think it's time for a rebirth. My name is Nona Jones, and I am the founder of the Faith and Prejudice movement. Nathan Rothstein once said that prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. The Faith and Prejudice movement exists to demonstrate our faith in God through the work of confronting and dismantling racism in America. This broadcast special features civil rights leaders, theologians, scholars, and advocates who have dedicated their lives and work to racial equity. I invite you to listen and learn so that we can mobilize our collective energy toward lasting change in this country.
My name is Sharon Miller, and I am the teaching pastor at Bright City Church in Durham, North Carolina. And we are honored to partner with and to support the Faith and Prejudice movement for a number of different reasons, but one in particular. For years and years, we have seen a trend in our nation where our culture likes to draw red tape around very specific issues and label those issues as political. And in so doing, what our culture is communicating is that this issue, it is controversial and it is therefore divisive. And for that reason, we should really beware of speaking about it or engaging it at all. Now, the huge shift that is taking place in our nation right now is that the people of God are waking up to the reality that a lot of those barriers that have been drawn around these issues are man-made, and that many of those issues are in fact in God's word, and that God is not silent about them. And as God's people, what we declare is that when God speaks, we speak. And so we see this Holy Spirit wind that is sweeping through our nation right now about one issue in particular, which is the matter of racism. God is not silent, and He is softening hearts, He is opening eyes, and He is inspiring people to act. And so in the midst of this huge shift in our nation, Faith and Prejudice has stepped up to equip and to inspire. And we truly believe this is a God-ordained moment. And so it is for that reason that we are thrilled about the work of Faith and Prejudice, and we are with them 100%.
Hey, this is Rich and Dawn Cherie Wilkerson, and we pastor VU Church here in Miami, Florida. We believe in the power of unity through the name of Jesus Christ. We also believe that the local church is the hope of the world. That's why we've decided to partner with Nona Jones, along with the Faith Prejudice movement, along with so many other churches across our nation, to confront and dismantle the spirit of racism in America once and for all.
We're so grateful to be locking arms with the Faith and Prejudice movement to confront the history of racism in our nation through an entire week dedicated to education, inspiration, and mobilization, July 6th through the 12th, all on Facebook. And together we're going to be listening, we're going to be learning from so many leaders who have given their life to confronting racism in our nation, social justice activists, civil rights leaders, and theologians will be speaking to all of us directly in our homes. And together, through the love of Jesus, we really believe that our nation can be changed.
We actually do believe that, and we actually believe in the power of unity. And right now, our prayer for our world is that the world would experience the tangible love of God through the church's unity. And as we come together united, we're believing that God is going to give us a new heart. And as He gives us a new heart, He's going to heal our land. Listen, Jesus said that when we stand together, well, that's how people would see and experience His love. I don't know if there's ever been a moment needed more now for all of us to stand together. You and I, we can bring change. I have hope for a better tomorrow in America, but it starts with you and it starts with me. Why don't you join us this week for Faith and Prejudice? We believe it's going to leave us all changed. God bless.
No matter what city you live in this country, everyone knows where the black side of town is. Relatedly, everyone knows where the white side of town is too. But ask the typical person why that is, and they are likely to say, I don't know, people just like to live near their own kind, I guess. Tonight, we're going to address this question head on because two of the foundational levers to economic prosperity in America is homeownership and education. But where you live in America is directly correlated with educational attainment. Instead of allowing our assumptions to guide our conclusions, we are going to explore how economic disenfranchisement of Black people in America originated and is perpetuated by the very systems that have allowed white communities to prosper. Right now, for every $100 of wealth within the white community, the Black community has $5. To help us ground our understanding of the economics of race, I am pleased to be joined by Richard Rothstein, Distinguished Fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, whose groundbreaking research on the history of segregation in America is chronicled in his best-selling book, The Color of Law. He joins us tonight to help us listen and learn about how federal, state, and local governments have worked together to deny Black people economic opportunity in the very nation they built. Richard, so honored to have you with us for this conversation. And before we even get into the conversation, I would love for you to introduce yourself to the viewers beyond the credentials, beyond the accolades and the resume that I've shared. Tell us about your family and how that lent itself to your research interests.
Well, I'm not sure how. I grew up in a liberal household. I grew up in Flushing, New York, an all-white community. I don't think I ever met any African Americans until I was in college. So it was all white, segregated community. But my parents were liberal. I remember they indoctrinated my brother and me with open ideas, even though we had no practical opportunity to experience other people. I remember when I was very little, they had we used to have, I'm as old as Joe Biden, so you can tell how old that is. But I remember when I was young in the 1940s, we had these, records that on record players. You don't know what those are, I know, but there was a thing you put on, and there was a needle, and it played. I remember a song that they used to play. You can get good milk from a brown-skinned cow. The color of your skin doesn't matter, no how. That was the kind of upbringing I had. But that was all. I never met any African Americans until I was in college, and then I was in college in 1959, and in February of 1960. 4 students from North Carolina A&T sat in at a Greensboro lunch counter, and it was in the Woolworths, and around the country, young people picketed Woolworths in support of the 4 Greensboro students. And a friend of mine recruited me to join the picket line. So that was my first civil rights demonstration in February of 1960. And one thing led to another. Here I am.
Wow, it's pretty interesting. So I want to just dive right into your work. And I think one of the questions I have is, why did you study residential segregation as a key variable in the economic state of Black America?
Well, I was working on education. That was the field I was involved in. I was an education columnist. I was the education columnist at the New York Times for several years. I worked as an education analyst at a research institute in Washington called the Economic Policy Institute. So that's all I knew, or I knew a lot about education. And I remember trying to explain how the achievement gap was created, which was the major problem that everybody was concerned about in public education. And the dominant narrative in the country in the 1990s and in early 2000s was that the reason we had an achievement gap was because teachers didn't have high expectations of Black students. And I thought that was nonsense. You could only, if you tested children more and held teachers accountable for their test scores, the achievement gap would disappear. And I wrote column after column explaining how the social and economic conditions that children come to school with is what creates the achievement gap primarily. And I remember writing one column, for example, about asthma. As you probably know, African American children in low-income neighborhoods and cities around the country have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class children, 4 times the rate. And they have asthma because they have diesel trucks driving through their neighborhoods and more deteriorated buildings and vermin in the environment, more polluted air generally. And I try to explain that if a child has asthma, that child may be up at night wheezing and is more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma to come to school the next day drowsy and sleepless. And I wrote that not every child who has asthma is going to come to school drowsy, but there's a greater chance. And if you have 2 groups of children who are equal identically in every respect, same racial makeup, same social and economic backgrounds, but one group had a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement. And you could go through condition after condition like this, so asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. And you add these all up and they explain the achievement gap, not teacher expectations. And then I realized as I was doing this work that if you have schools where you concentrate children who either have asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or any of these other conditions, it's impossible for a school like that to have the kind of achievement that a school where children come to school well-rested and in good health, well-nourished, and secure homes are going to have. And we call those schools where we concentrate children with these disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And the reason the schools are segregated is the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that neighborhood segregation might be an educational issue. That's how I began doing this. Well, that was 10 or more years ago, and I haven't written about education since. I've only been learning about how residential segregation, housing segregation was created. But that's how it started. I came to this because I was concerned about educational policy.
I think this is interesting because a lot of times issues of race are viewed in a silo. And what you essentially just described is the intricate connectivity between systems. And I think about, de jure segregation, which legally mandated racial segregation through tools like slave codes, Jim Crow, laws like that. They were essentially outlawed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But the question that keeps ringing through my mind that I would love you to speak to is, how is it that 56 years later, we still have Black and white sides of town?
Well, once you establish residential segregation in the rigid way in which federal, state, and local policy established it in the 20th century, it's very hard to demolish without equally intentional policy. Let me give you an example. After World War II, the federal government embarked on a program to move the entire white working class population out of urban areas into single-family homes in all white suburbs. It was an explicit racial program of the federal government implemented by the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration, returning World War II veterans, for example. We weren't a suburban country at this time in the mid-20th century. Suburbs were only for very rich people. The middle class hadn't moved to the suburbs. Working class families, middle class families were living in urban areas, in some cases in integrated neighborhoods. But the federal government decided it was going to move all the white families out of urban areas into single-family homes in the suburbs. And you're familiar, and I know that your listeners are familiar, your viewers are familiar with these suburbs. They exist in every metropolitan area in the country. They surround cities. They've created a white noose around every metropolitan area in the country. The biggest of these suburbs, east of New York City, was Levittown. 17,000 homes in one place. But from the East Coast, Levittown, to the West Coast, south of San Francisco, Westlake, Daly City or in Los Angeles, places like Westchester or Lakewood. All of these giant suburbs were created, as well as many, many smaller ones, by the federal government. A developer like William Levitt, who built Levittown, he was a bigot. He wouldn't have sold to an African American if he could avoid it. In fact, he said he would never sell to an African American, but he could never build this suburb without federal subsidy because no bank would be crazy enough to lend someone money to build 17,000 homes, to buy the land to build 17,000 homes, for which he didn't have a single contract, a single buyer yet. The only way that Levitt could build Levittown, or the builder in Westlake and south of San Francisco, his name was Henry Dolger, or any of these others, the only way they could build these suburbs was by going to the Federal Housing Administration or the Veterans Administration and getting a bank guarantee for their loans. In order to get that bank guarantee, Levitt and all these others had to make a commitment to the Federal Housing Administration never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration even required Levitt to put a clause in the deed of every home, and this is true in suburbs all over the country, put a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. So that's how he got the bank loan. He bank guaranteed to build this development. Well, he sold those homes for, $100,000 in today's money. It was $8,000 or $9,000 at the time. These were very modest working class homes, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, all to white families only. Those homes no longer sell today for $100,000. As you know, you can't buy a home in these suburbs, in these all-white suburbs, for $100,000. Depending on the area of the country, it could be $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, maybe $1 million where I'm living now. The white families, returning war veterans, these were not rich people. These were not even middle class. They were working class families. They became middle class through this program. They gained over the next few generations equity as their homes appreciated in value from, say, $100,000 to $500,000. They used that equity, that $400,000 in wealth that they gained from this federal subsidy to buy these homes. They used it to send their children to college. They used it to take care of perhaps emergencies, temporary unemployment, or maybe medical emergencies. They used it for their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their own children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. So we asked, why is this affected today? In 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you can now move to Levittown or Westlake or any of these other places. These federal policies no longer apply. We're repealing them. You can move anywhere you want. But those homes are no longer affordable to working class families of any race, whites or blacks, unless they have down payment assistance from their parents, can't buy starter homes in these communities. So the policy that was implemented in the mid-20th century still excludes them today because the suburbs have appreciated in value. So if take Levittown again, I'll use that as an example because it's the most famous one. Levittown today, as a result of the Fair Housing Act, some African Americans have moved into Levittown because it can't discriminate anymore. Levittown is about 2% African American today. In a neighborhood that's about 15% African American. So the difference between that 2% and the 15% is the difference attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that's never been remedied. And simply passing a law that says, okay, you're free to move there now, doesn't remedy the constitutional violation that was perpetuated by government in the 20th century.
This is so fascinating. And I feel like it's important for people who are watching this. I've seen so many comment threads with people saying there is no such thing as systemic racism. It's all made up in people's minds. What you have described is, in my view, the classic definition of systemic racism. And I'd love it if you could just describe what is systemic racism for people who are listening to this, who are like, wow, that sounds really weird, but that's systemic racism, right?
Well, yes, but I prefer to call it unconstitutional racial segregation, because it's important that people understand that it's not simply systemic, but it was created explicitly by government policy, explicitly, because understanding that it's an unconstitutional system imposes an obligation on all of us as American citizens to remedy it. Simply saying it's, and I'm not criticizing the term, but simply saying systemic racism doesn't impose any obligation on anybody to do anything about it. It's just too bad. There was a Supreme Court decision that actually got me started on this, in which Chief Justice John Roberts said that the reason we have segregation in this country is because of private decisions of banks and real estate agents, actors in the private economy, or bigoted landlords who wouldn't rent to African Americans, or people wanting to live with each other in the same race, or maybe economic differences. And he said if you have all these private decisions that created residential segregation, you're not permitted to do anything to fix it. If government didn't create it, government is not permitted to uncreate it. Once we understand that this is an unconstitutional system of residential segregation that we have, imposed by federal government and state and local governments as well, that imposes an obligation upon us. So I think that it's important to emphasize the unconstitutional nature of the segregation that we have, because that means we have to step up and do something about it. We don't have a choice as American citizens. That's our obligation.
That's such an important reframing, Richard. And I think even for myself, understanding, you're right, when we call it systemic racism, in some ways it becomes a passive observation. But the idea that, no, this is unconstitutional makes it active. You referenced earlier about, veterans coming home from the war and how they were essentially given tools and mechanisms to begin to create a middle class status. The GI Bill was supposed to create economic opportunity for veterans, including Black veterans. But many people who are watching this may not realize that while their families benefited from a GI loan, my grandfather wasn't able to get a GI loan simply because he was Black. Can you talk more about that and why that's significant to this discussion?
Well, that's what I was describing with, for example, Levittown or any of these other suburbs. In my book, I describe returning war veterans who could not move into Levittown. There was one case I talk about in the book of a very entrepreneurial African-American war veteran who, after the war, built a hauling company, a trucking company that delivered construction materials to construction sites. He had a contract with Levitt to deliver sheetrock to Levittown, but he wasn't permitted, and his family wasn't permitted to buy into the suburb that they helped build because it was a whites-only development. So this was a federal government creation. As I said before, Levitt was a bigot. If left to his own devices, he wouldn't have sold to African Americans. But he wasn't left to his own devices. If he had gone to the federal government and said, look, nobody's going to lend me money to build 17,000 homes in one place. I want a federal bank guarantee to build the suburb. And the federal government said, sure, we'll guarantee your bank loans provided you sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis. He would have had to do it, bigot or no. And so I'm less concerned with people's inner bigotry. I mean, I think it's a problem, but I'm more concerned with the explicit policies that permitted that bigotry to flourish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of, I would love to talk a bit about the history of exclusionary zoning ordinances, because, I think, again, this idea of white side of town, Black side of town, many people know, even in Gainesville, like I can tell you the white side and the Black side. Where I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, I can tell you the white side and the Black side. But could you share the kind of the origins of these practices and ordinances, not just practices, the actual ordinances, and how they impacted the Black community?
Well, once we establish rigid segregation through government policy, explicit government policy designed to exclude African Americans from many neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods in particular. But once we establish that rigid, unconstitutional segregation, it doesn't take explicit policy to maintain it. Race-neutral policy can maintain it. So once you have government-created single-family home suburbs for whites and neighborhoods with apartments for African Americans. Once you've created that dichotomy, you can pass an ordinance in those single-family home suburbs, which are race neutral. They don't target blacks. They just simply say that this suburb is for single-family homes only. But then, as I mentioned before, as the suburbs gain in value, effectively it prohibits anybody but the original owners or their descendants from living there. So we need, if we want to address this, we need to abolish those race-neutral policies like single-family zoning, exclusionary zoning, that maintain the exclusive nature of the community, even if the zoning ordinances themselves don't mention race. They serve to perpetuate an unconstitutionally created system.
And taking a step back from there, for people who may not be aware, can you walk us through the history of redlining?
Sure. When the New Deal began in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took office during the Depression, it was the Depression, as I said. At that time, the only way families could own homes, except the very most affluent families who bought them entirely with cash, but the only kind of mortgage you could get in 1933 in this country was an interest-only loan with a term of 5 to 7 years. Every 7 years, or every 7 years, you had to refinance your loan. You had to find a new bank loan. You didn't have any equity because you were paying only interest on this loan. You had to find a new bank loan to maintain your home. Well, during the Depression, people who owned homes couldn't get new bank loans. There were no mortgages available, and people were being foreclosed, losing their homes. So the New Deal established an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation was designed to provide for the first time 30-year, at that time 20-year, later extended to 30, 20-year mortgages that were amortized, meaning that people gained equity by making monthly payments that included both interest and principal. That was the first time that happened. The other thing that the Homeowners Loan Corporation did was it drew maps of every metropolitan area in the country, in which it colored red the areas that it recommended would be too risky for federal agencies to guarantee mortgages. And those neighborhoods where African Americans lived, poor people generally. So that's how the term, and they were colored red if they were too risky. That's where the term redlining came from. It was the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps of every metropolitan area that designated areas where the federal government should not get involved in supporting home ownership. Now, that term now has come to be used much more broadly to describe not only the refusal of federal agencies to support home ownership in existing Black neighborhoods, but the kinds of policy I described before, which was the exclusion of African Americans from white neighborhoods, from a single-family home suburban neighborhoods. So we now talk about redlining generally as a policy that segregated the country, but actually it originated only for the purpose of prohibiting the federal government or recommending that the federal government not guarantee loans in neighborhoods that African Americans lived in.
And thinking through where African Americans lived, like I want to double click on this because I think this part of history is often overlooked or ignored or maybe simply misunderstood. I'm not sure what the appropriate descriptor is, but in so many instances where Black people lived was essentially forced upon them. It wasn't that they just chose to live in these places, as you described earlier, industrial areas. They were in many ways forced to live there. Can you explain that as well for those who don't understand that history?
Well, they were forced to live there because they weren't permitted to live elsewhere. When low-income workers migrate to an urban area, and this is not only true of African Americans who are coming out of the South, but European immigrants or today Central American immigrants, they tend to locate in the single neighborhoods. their families are there. They have networks. Their language is spoken. In the case of immigrants, they have people who can recommend them to jobs because they know people. They have their churches and local institutions that preserve their culture. So concentrations of low-income families is a commonplace occurrence in urban history in this country. And that was true of African Americans leaving the former slave states, as well as for immigrants of other groups. But with all other groups, once they got jobs, once they became working class and more stable economically, in the second or third generation, they were able to move out of those low-income neighborhoods into other areas. African Americans, unlike Jews or Italians or Irish, all of whom started out the same way, or today Mexicans, African Americans were prohibited from moving out with the policies that I just described. So their history, African Americans' history, is unique in that respect. And it was not even though the neighborhoods, the low-income concentrations of African Americans may have started with natural forces, as with the Irish and the Jews and the Polish and the Italians, the reinforcement of that segregation by the prohibition of their moving out as their incomes improved is unique to the African American experience in this country.
I've spoken with many white friends over the last few weeks who have been very honest in saying, I did not realize just how hurtful the Black experience has been in this country. They just said, I didn't realize the depth. I have contended that part of the reason for that is because what we are taught in schools is not true history. And I would love, I know I watched an interview with you where you said that you actually examined all of the high school history textbooks in America. I would love if you could just share with everyone, what you found.
Yes, well, I wouldn't say I examined all of them, but I examined all the most commonly used ones. High school textbooks, 11th grade typically is where American history is taught. And I found that in every case, they lied about the history of how the government segregated African Americans. They have effusive passages about the New Deal and how it created suburban homes for working class families, never anywhere mentioning it was only for white working class families. They talk about the great work that the New Deal did in building housing, public housing, for example, for working class families. Public housing didn't begin as something for poor people. It began as a program for working class families who could afford to pay rent for housing. But during the Depression, no housing was available. The textbooks talk about how this housing was built, never once mentioning that it was always on a segregated basis. The federal government built separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently segregating places that had never before been segregated. We had a lot of integrated downtown neighborhoods in the 20th century. Many people are surprised when they hear that. They were integrated for the simple reason that we were a manufacturing economy. And factories had to be located in a central location near ports or deep water ports or railroad terminals. They get their parts and ship their final products. So if you had a factory district that was located near a deep water port or railroad terminal that had both Black and white workers in it, they had to live in broadly the same neighborhoods. They could walk to work. They didn't have cars to drive in from the suburbs that didn't even exist. Well, the federal government segregated many of those neighborhoods by creating public projects for working class families, separate projects for whites and Blacks. And I'm not talking about the South. You don't have to feel bad coming from Florida. This was a national program, and a smug, self-satisfied place like Cambridge, Massachusetts, the area between maybe you've heard of it, the area between Harvard and MIT. It's called the Central Square neighborhood. It was about 50% Black, 50% white in the 1930s. The federal government went into that place and created separate projects, one for Blacks, one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation in the Boston metropolitan area. that persists to this day. So the textbooks don't mention any of this at all. And I am encouraged, I am hopeful about the awareness that many of your white friends now have about the African-American experience. And it's really hopeful. The hundreds of thousands of people who've marched in demonstrations, Black Lives Matter, some of them in white communities that, like me growing up, where people have never met an African-American. But that has to translate into action. It can't simply be awareness. And one very simple thing that people can do, and now I'm getting back to your question, one very simple thing that people can do to start with is demand that their school districts teach this history fairly and accurately. So that, because if young people don't understand our constitutional obligation to redress segregation any better than the current generations do, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as our generations have been. So that's a very first step that we can take, is to create committees. I call them local civil rights committees that are going to demand and take action to insist that schools teach this history accurately, stop using textbooks that lie about it. There are curriculum materials out there that are available. There's one that I helped create, but there are others as well. I don't mind if you give my email address. If people want copies of this curriculum, they can write to me and get it. And they can go to their school districts and demand that their teachers be trained to use it, so that young people understand this history. I've interviewed lots of young people lately, African Americans as well as Hispanic and other minority students and white students. It's shocking how little young people today know about racial history in this country. The civil rights movement, all they know is Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. They have no idea of anything else beyond that. They have no idea of the kinds of marches and demonstrations and direct action that was taken. That may be required to redress residential segregation as well. But the first step, I think, is to re-educate our young people so that they don't leave school with this de facto segregation myth that almost all adults have in this country today.
Well, that's really the driving heartbeat behind Faith and Prejudice, is not even for this next generation, but for the people now who have, whether it's due to willful ignorance or unintended ignorance, have been just completely unaware of this history, trying to create a platform to educate everyone so we can mobilize. I'm curious, as I listened to you and your research, and I read your book and I shared this with you, it was life-changing for me as a Black woman to read it. How has the response been to your work, and not even so much in communities that are, likely to embrace it, but the people who maybe weren't? What has the response been?
Well, let me just say first that African Americans don't know this history any more than whites do. African Americans know they're segregated, but they accept the de facto myth just as whites do.
So true.
So everywhere I go, and I speak to audiences of whites and African Americans. Sometimes they mix, sometimes they're separate audiences, depending on where I go. The people's first reaction is, how come I didn't learn this in school? How come I didn't know this? And the subtitle of my book, because the title is The Color of Law, but the subtitle is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It was never hidden. It's a forgotten history. Obviously, anybody who moved, any white family who moved into these segregated single-family home suburbs like Levittown, they knew that they were excluded, that they were exclusive communities. In Levittown, at the time it was built, there were some residents who created a committee to desegregate Levittown. They knew that this federally subsidized project was a segregated project. People who moved into these separate public housing projects knew that they were being directed to one if they were Black and to another one if they were white. There's nothing hidden about this history. We've somehow whitewashed our memories about it. So the first thing that people ask is, how come I didn't know about it? And that's why I place so much emphasis on changing school curricula so that people are taught this history. But the second thing they ask is, what can I do about it? And there, I have to say, is simply being woke to this reality is not enough. What's necessary is creating new civil rights groups in communities all over this country. And we say that a civil rights group has to be biracial. It cannot be white-led, because whites can't go around telling African Americans how they can live. But it can't be black-led either, because blacks don't have the political power in this country to make these kinds of changes by themselves. So people have to reach across racial divides and create biracial civil rights groups to take the kind of action that's going to be necessary to implement policies to redress it.
So I think what you just said really kind of leads to the almost final question. It's probably not the final one because I have so many more, but almost final is thinking about remedies. So yes, it is true that education is an important step, and this platform exists to provide education, but we also exist for mobilization. I would love your thoughts on remedies. And of course, there's the individual. What can the individual do? But then there's also the question, as you said, of like the broader system, the broader constitution. What are your thoughts on the remedies to this situation?
Well, no, let me say that we know what the remedies are. There's no mystery about the remedies. Policy institutes, housing groups write about these things all the time. What's missing is not remedies, the idea of remedies. What's missing is a new civil rights movement that's going to demand them. So I think the first thing that your viewers need to do is reach across racial divides and create the kinds of interracial, biracial relationships that are necessary as a base for a new civil rights movement. So many African Americans and whites, like me growing up, don't have really meaningful relationships with people of the other race. They work with them. We have interracial workplaces now, but beyond work, people don't have ongoing close social relationships with people of the other race. And that, out of those relationships, a new civil rights movement can grow. So that's the first step. The remedies, that as the civil rights movement gets more powerful, the remedies, as I say, are well known. One is, I talked before about how these exclusive suburbs are unaffordable to people who were historically unconstitutionally excluded from them. We need subsidies. We need to implement subsidies for qualified African Americans. I'm not talking about poor people. Most African Americans are not poor. They're working class. They have jobs. They can afford housing, but they can't afford housing in the communities from which they had been excluded, which they could have afforded had they not been excluded. So we need subsidies to take Levittown, for example, as I was talking about, and move it from 2% African American to 15% African American. That won't happen naturally, simply with the Fair Housing Act. We have programs for low-income families as well that disproportionately benefit minorities, African Americans and Hispanics in particular. They reinforce segregation today. They need to be reformed. The biggest subsidy we have for low-income housing is something administered by the Treasury Department, the U.S. Treasury Department. It's called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. The Treasury Department regulations, get this, the Treasury Department regulations place a priority on placing low-income housing tax credit developments in existing low-income neighborhoods. It doesn't say it's doing this for the purpose of redress of reinforcing segregation, but that's its priority. That's backwards. The Treasury Department ought to be forcing the placement of at least some of these developments, many more than now are the case, in high opportunity communities that would help to desegregate them. We have a program called the Section 8 voucher program that many of your viewers are probably familiar with. It's a subsidy to families, the lowest income families, to afford to rent apartments. That program also reinforces segregation because, as you say, so many communities that are high opportunity communities where their children could go to good schools and have healthy air and access to good foods, those communities exclude them with zoning ordinances. So we need to revamp the Section 8 program so that together with the abolition of exclusionary zoning, people can move to diverse communities. So the policies, the remedies are well known. There's no political support at this point, despite the great awakening we have about racial history and racial injustice. There's no political support for these policies, but that's the next step. And I am so hopeful today that people can take the next step because we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow today in this country than we ever have had in American history. Moving from discussion of the history to action is the next step, and we need to take that.
So I want to, because many of the people watching this are pastors, white pastors in particular, and I've talked to many of them who, for the first time, they've actually spoken out against injustice, and they have experienced so much heat and just vitriol. And I think what you've done for all of us is you've laid out such a clear case for the need for leadership. I think as a final question, I would love it. It's not really a question, but an invitation. If there's any encouragement you would like to offer to people who are leading during this time, and they're just feeling the discomfort, which is to be expected, the discomfort of leading in this moment. If there's anything you'd like to say to them as an encouragement, that would be appreciated.
Yes, I would actually. I'm glad you mentioned that. You may have seen me get up to pull a book down from my bookshelf. I just read a book. It's called Let's Have Lunch by Steve McCutcheon. This is a Presbyterian minister in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. As you know better than I do, Presbyterian churches are segregated. In Winston-Salem, North Carolina, there were three, in the 1990s, there were 3 white Presbyterian churches and 3 black Presbyterian churches. And one of the ministers of the white church, this was after Rodney King was beaten in Los Angeles, and he was troubled by it. He realized that he didn't know any African Americans to speak of, even though there were African American Presbyterian churches in his own community. So he called up the pastor of one of the black Presbyterian churches and said, let's have lunch. And out of that lunch grew something called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue, in which they created an organization that included parishioners from the churches, both black and white. They had a very rigid rule that they had to have equal members from black churches and white churches. And that group, the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue in Winston-Salem, went on to not only build Habitat for Humanity houses, working together, but they pressed the city to create a civilian review board of the police action. They did some work on changing the curriculum of the schools so it taught a more accurate racial history, not accurate enough. But it took those kinds of steps. I hope that the ministers that you're talking about who are watching your program will call up ministers of other race churches and create those same kinds of dialogues. It's a great model of how to move forward. Now, the one I was talking about in Winston-Salem, they didn't have a sophisticated understanding of the kinds of policies that are needed to desegregate Winston-Salem. The things they did were fairly modest, like building Habitat for Humanity houses or pressing the civilian review boards, all important. But with the greater understanding that we have today of the policies that are needed to redress segregation, groups like that can go a lot farther. So I hope that some of your viewers will take that kind of initiative.
Wow. Well, Richard, this has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to speak with you. I'm going to make sure that we link the curriculum resource that you've authored on the website. So it'll be at faithandprejudice.com. The reason I want to do that is I don't think you want a couple million people emailing you, but we will make sure we link it to the website. And I would just strongly encourage everyone, by the color of law, read it, underline it, make notes as I did, share it with your friends and your family, because as you said, Richard, it's so true. We have to know our history before we can even think about reshaping or shaping the future. We have to know our history. So thank you for making the time. And I'm just so honored that you did.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to say something that's going to shock you. but I love to correspond with readers of this book. And you should feel free to share my email address.
Okay.
Only people who read the book and have further questions. I don't want them to write to me asking me to tell them something that they could read.
Yes.
If I want to discuss it, I love to engage with people in those kinds of conversations. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you all so much for watching.
How you doing? I'm Miles McPherson, pastor of the Rock Church in San Diego and author of The Third Option, Hope for a Racially Divided Nation. And we desperately need hope. I'm sure you heard of the phrase that money isn't the root of all evil, but the love of money is. I would also argue that evil comes from the love of how money makes us feel, especially when we compare ourselves to those who have less of it. We are confronted with the reality of the economic discrepancies and inequalities throughout the world. All too often, these discrepancies are aligned with racial differences. This can lead to a belief by some that more money correlates to more personal value. In other words, the rich are more valuable than the poor. Since there is a much higher percentage of rich people who are white than black, the conclusion, based on the above logic, is that whites are more valuable than blacks. However, we all know that all people have equal value before God, and as all people are made in the image of the same God. Economic advantage is not bad in of itself unless it leads someone to think that they are more valuable than others simply because of it. We must acknowledge that racism is a spiritual issue before it's an economic one, because racism is seeing God's image in yourself as more valuable than in other people. This is problematic when you see yourself as more valuable because you have more money, or when you value someone less because they have less wealth. The value of the image of God cannot be increased or decreased by money or possessions. In Matthew 18 in the Bible, there's a story about a servant who owed his master 10,000 talents. He begged for forgiveness and received it and had his debt forgiven. He then in turn went and found someone who owed him 100 denarii, much less. This man begged forgiveness, but he was not given it. When the master of them both heard that the forgiven servant gave no forgiveness, he seized him and put him in jail. Because every person is made in the image of God, we should not only accept the call of God to ensure equitable economic system, but we should never hold a position of superiority over someone because of their inferior financial status. We need to walk humbly, honoring one another, and as grateful recipients of the blessings of God. Because at the end of the day, we are all only stewards or custodians of what God has entrusted us with. As we prepare for the National Weekend of Action in 2 days, let's remember that racism is seeing the image of God in yourself as more valuable than in someone who looks different. So let me ask you a question. Do you feel that your wealth makes you more valuable to God than someone who has less money than you? Do you defend the right to receive better treatment based on the fact that you possess more wealth than someone else? So you have a choice to make. Contribute to a culture of racism by arguing and defending your sense of value because of your superior financial status, or contribute to a culture of unity and love by repenting and confessing such sentiments. As we transition into a time of prayer, spend a few minutes praying in these 3 areas. Ask God to forgive you of any sense of pride over anyone who is different than you. Ask God to help you see the image of God in every person. Ask God to lead you to heal any breach between your heart and the hearts of your African-American brothers and sisters. God bless you.
Hey, I'm Reggie Joyner, CEO of Orange, and our organization exists to influence those who influence the faith of the next generation. And we believe we are living in a defining moment in our history because of the conversations that are happening right now around race. As a white leader and pastor, I'm convinced that the way we respond to this issue is important for a lot of reasons. But here's one reason I want you to consider. There's a generation of kids and teenagers who will decide what they believe about God and the church based on how we respond to this issue of race. And that's why I'm so excited about so many of the conversations that are happening right now. And that's why I want to invite you to join Orange as we participate with key leaders around our country for a Faith and Prejudice masterclass. It will be a 4-week experience where you can learn from experts in the space of racial justice and reconciliation through weekly videos. You'll also be able to take part in constructive weekly conversations via Zoom with Nona Jones and other seasoned leaders. It's called Faith and Prejudice because our faith should affect our prejudice. Our faith should compel us to confront the racism that exists in this generation. Here's why. Because if we don't, then our prejudice will continue to negatively affect the faith of a generation who's watching us. I really hope you'll join a host of churches and families to do what I'm going to do, to listen, to learn. Because until we understand the whys that exist behind some of the prejudice in our country, we can't really be a part of the solution. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, during the beginning of the civil rights movement. During those decades, too many of us didn't show up for this conversation. That's why the Faith and Prejudice Initiative is so important now. That's why I'm so hopeful in this decade we have a chance to do something we didn't 50 years ago. Let's get it right this time. To register, please go to thinkorange.com/faith and prejudice.
We have been challenged, but more than challenged, we have been called. You are not watching this by accident. You are watching this because you have been called to be the change we so desperately need in this country. James chapter 2, verse 17 compels us as Christians to allow the works of our faith to demonstrate what we believe. So now, visit faithandprejudice.com for resources to put your faith to work. Thank you for watching.